Ever wondered what lies on the other side of that earth-shattering spiritual awakening you've heard whispers about, or perhaps even brushed against yourself? Imagine this. You've navigated a seismic spiritual revelation, a moment so profound it felt like the bedrock of your reality cracking open. Or maybe it was a quieter, more insidious crumbling, the slow personal identity you'd painstakingly built, dissolving like sugar in rain. Suddenly, the ground beneath your feet, once so solid and reliable, feels like shifting sand. Everything that was once intimately familiar, your routines, your beliefs, your very sense of self, now appears strangely foreign, as if viewed through a distorted lens. You've done it. You've pierced the shimmering veil of illusion, glimpsing the intricate, often unsettling machinery of your own conditioned patterns, the hidden gears that drove your reactions and choices. You've finally tuned out the deafening, relentless noise of the world, the cacophony of expectations, demands, and distractions that once defined your days. And then, in its place, came the silence. At first, this newfound silence feels utterly sacred, a sanctuary. There's an undeniable power in it, an empowering liberation akin to stepping out of a burning, smoke-filled building into the crisp, clean, life-giving air. You breathe deeply, relieved, thinking, this is it. This is the peace I've been searching for. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to shift within that quietude. Meaning, the vibrant tapestry that once gave color and purpose to your existence starts to dissolve. It's not a dramatic, catastrophic implosion, but a quiet, unnerving disappearance, as if your very soul has gently dimmed the lights on life, and then, in a moment of cosmic forgetfulness, forgot to turn them back on. The striving, the relentless push to achieve, to become, to prove, it all just stops. You cease performing, not from a place of bitter despair or cynical resignation, but from a kind of sacred exhaustion, a profound hollowing out that feels paradoxically both strangely peaceful and yet unnervingly deeply still. And into this stillness, a new sound begins to emerge, a quiet, persistent, aching whisper of a question. Now that I've seen the truth, now that the illusions have fallen away, why do I feel so utterly, profoundly empty? This, right here, is the colossal paradox of the awakening journey that very few spiritual guides or Instagram gurus ever seem to warn you about. We are often led down a garden path, encouraged to believe that a spiritual awakening will be this glorious, explosive event that will instantly inflame our life's purpose, making us burn with an unwavering, luminous clarity once we see through the world's illusions. The expectation is that seeing the truth will set us on fire, energizing us with a divine mission. But for many, particularly those souls who are inherently sensitive, the deep seekers, the empaths whose hearts beat in tune with the world's subtle energies, the dedicated inward travelers who have long navigated the landscapes of their inner worlds. For these individuals, the awakening often does something entirely different. It doesn't just fill them up, it first empties the vessel thoroughly. It meticulously scrapes out all the false motives, the ego-driven desires, the socially conditioned ambitions, until even the very concept of desire itself becomes almost unrecognizable, a foreign word from a forgotten language. And in that vast echoing void where the old self and its motivations once resided, we often find ourselves profoundly confused, misinterpreting this sacred emptying, this divine clearing as a descent into apathy or a sign that we've somehow failed at awakening. I remember a poignant conversation with a dear friend, a woman of brilliant intellect, deeply spiritually attuned and fluent in the profound teachings of Eckhart Tolle, Krishnamurti, and Alan Watts. She had just emerged from what she described as an intensely transformative dark night of the soul, her insight crystalline, her understanding profound. She recounted to me with a quiet certainty how she had seen through the grand illusions of personal identity, the hollowness of relentless achievement, the often conditional nature of external love. It sounded like a triumphant breakthrough. Yet, a mere 2 months later, I found her lying in bed, staring listlessly at the ceiling, adrift in a stillness she had never anticipated, a quietude that felt more like a barren desert than a fertile oasis. "I used to cry about not doing enough, about not being enough," she confided, her voice barely a whisper. Now I find I don't really care if I do anything at all. I genuinely thought awakening would set my soul on fire. Instead," she paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air, "I feel utterly extinguished." This perplexing threshold, this no man's land of the spirit, was a territory Shi Heng Yi spoke of with profound understanding. He described it not as a failing, but as the sacred, often terrifying, terrain that lies squarely between the collapse of the egoic, constructed self and the true, authentic birth of the deeper self. It is, in essence, a liminal space, a transitional phase that is inherently unsettling in its profound quiet, a place where the motivation that was once vigorously powered by the persona, the social mask we wear, and the relentless hunger for social approval simply dissolves, leaving behind only the raw, unformed clay of what has not yet been shaped into its new form. This, Shi Heng Yi emphasized, is not a sign of failure or regression. It is, in fact, a crucial stage of individuation, the psyche's chrysalis stage, wherein the old caterpillar self must literally dissolve into a seeming formlessness, a primordial soup of potential, before it can ever hope to re-emerge as the butterfly. This experience is the psychological death that is an absolute prerequisite for any genuine rebirth. However, it is critically important that we do not mislabel this void, this period of seeming inactivity and emptiness, as a step backward or a sign of spiritual stagnation. For within the very heart of this emptiness, if we can bear to sit with it, lives a deeper, more subtle call, a quiet, persistent pulse of soul truth patiently waiting to be heard. This isn't the loud, clamoring motivation to prove oneself, to achieve, or to gain external validation. Instead, it is a gentle, almost imperceptible impulse to simply be, to move, not out of a desperate need for recognition or to fill a void, but out of an inner resonance, a deep, quiet alignment with something far more authentic. This exploration, therefore, is not about wallowing in despair or pathologizing a natural spiritual process. It is about understanding and honoring that pivotal, often misunderstood, moment after the initial awakening, when the old familiar fuel source has sputtered and died, and the new, infinitely more sustainable source of soul energy is still quietly, sacredly, and often slowly forming in the depths of our being. As Shi Heng Yi so wisely articulated, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. In this light, the apparent loss of motivation is not the desolate end of your journey. It is, in fact, the sacred, fertile beginning of learning to live not as a carefully constructed mask, but as an authentic, embodied soul. Shi Heng Yi, the veritable architect of analytical psychology, possessed an uncanny foresight into this strange, silent fog that often descends after the initial fireworks of an awakening, long before it became a common topic whispered about in modern spiritual circles or wellness blogs. He didn't romanticize it or cloak it in purely mystical or euphoric language. Instead, he spoke with a piercing, almost surgical clarity about the soul's necessary descent into its own profound depths once the vast, often ignored territories of the unconscious begin to genuinely stir. Enlightenment, Shi Heng Yi once wrote, does not come by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And while those words may sound beautifully poetic, even inspiring, they carry a stark, often uncomfortable and terrible truth. Real, sustainable awakening does not simply crown you with perpetual bliss and effortless joy. More often, it strips you bare. It meticulously unravels the intricate scaffolding of the false self, the persona you've spent a lifetime constructing and curating. It initiates a slow, sacred, and sometimes agonizing death, the death of who you believed yourself to be, the collapse of the identity you mistook for your entirety. This collapse is profoundly internal, yet its repercussions are far-reaching, rippling through every aspect of your existence. Your former motives, the driving forces behind your ambitions, your relentless pursuit of achievement, your deep-seated need for recognition, all begin to dissolve like mist in the morning sun. The meticulously planned timelines you once followed with unwavering determination, the cherished goals that once pulled you forward with such compelling force, even the very structures of identity that defined your relationships, your work, your daily rhythm, and your place in the world, all start to fade, becoming as insubstantial as mirages, shimmering under the intense light of a deeper, more fundamental truth. But here's where the psychological nuance becomes absolutely vital. Your ego, that sense of I-ness, does not simply disappear into thin air. It doesn't die in the way we might dramatically imagine. Rather, it becomes profoundly disoriented, like a seasoned actor whose script has suddenly been incinerated mid-performance with no new lines yet provided. The result isn't true laziness or a clinical apathy, but a profound spiritual limbo. You are no longer asleep, lost in the dream of illusion, but you are not yet fully awake and integrated into what comes next. This intervening space, this is the profound mystery. This peculiar in-between state, this profound disorientation of the ego, is what Shi Heng Yi, drawing from ancient alchemical traditions, called the negrado, the blackening phase of the alchemical process. It is that crucial period when the old structures of the ego have been significantly dismantled, perhaps even shattered, but the true integrated self has not yet fully ascended to take its rightful place on the throne of your consciousness. In modern, everyday terms, this often looks and feels like a baffling and persistent demotivation, a lack of drive that can be deeply concerning. However, in the rich and nuanced language of Shi Heng Yi's teachings, it is understood as a holy pause, a sacred interlude, an essential in-between space where the soul deliberately retreats inward, almost like a spiritual hermit, to meticulously rewrite its foundational myth, its core operating principles. And yet, our contemporary culture, with its relentless obsession with productivity, progress, and perpetual motion, deeply fears this silence, this apparent stillness. Shi Heng Yi astutely warned that the modern world, in its hyperactivity and external focus, does everything within its considerable power to avoid this crucial phase of inner work, to pathologize it as depression, to numb it with distractions, to medicate it into submission, precisely because it cannot comprehend a mode of transformation that doesn't look like linear, measurable, outward progress. But what you might be experiencing, if these words resonate, is not a regression or a step backward. It is, in fact, an initiation, a sacred descent into the fertile unknown. It is not a sign of dysfunction, but a profound and necessary journey into the soul's depths. This is typically not depression in the purely clinical sense, though it may indeed share some of its shadowy characteristics and feel incredibly heavy. More accurately, it is the soul itself, in its burgeoning wisdom, refusing to continue participating in a life, in a set of roles, in a way of being that it no longer genuinely resonates with, a life that feels inauthentic to its core. And that courageous refusal, Shi Heng Yi believed, was the very beginning of individuation, the sacred, lifelong process of becoming the true, whole, and integrated self. Most people, it seems, never speak of this part of the journey, do they? They don't often share the persistent ache that can follow the initial burst of light, or the profound, sometimes deafening silence that settles in after the grand revelation. But this silence, this void, is not empty in a barren sense. It is profoundly formative. And if you can find the courage and the patience to learn to stand still inside it, to truly listen to what it asks of you, what it reveals to you, you may eventually come to see that what initially looks and feels like a frustrating demotivation is actually the very beginning of a much deeper, more authentic alignment. The world, with its superficial judgments, might tell you you're lost. Shi Heng Yi, however, would likely say you are being reformed, reshaped by something far more honest, far more real. If you found yourself drifting through this peculiar, often disorienting haze that so frequently follows an awakening, staring into a stillness where your familiar spark once burned so brightly, please know this with every fiber of your being. You are not broken. You are not failing. You are instead undergoing a profound psychic shift, a metamorphosis so deep and fundamental that it doesn't merely challenge your existing thoughts and beliefs. It actively reconfigures the very architecture of your inner world. The ambitions that once lit a roaring fire in your chest, the pressing deadlines that drove your days, the carefully crafted 5-year visions, the motivational mantras of hustle and grind that you once chanted with conviction. All of these now fall strangely flat, not because you've suddenly become incapable or lazy, but because the very structure, the very foundation within you that once housed and fueled your motivation, is itself disintegrating. Shi Heng Yi, with his profound insight into the human psyche, foresaw this intricate unraveling long before it was ever whispered about on digital platforms or in self-help forums. Let us endeavor to understand this clearly, for it is a cornerstone of this transitional experience. For most of your life, your primary source of energy, your drive, stemmed from the persona, that carefully constructed self, the social mask you meticulously fashioned and wore to navigate the complexities of the world, to gain acceptance, and to achieve your goals. That identity, the one who yearned to be admired, validated, and applauded, was not inherently a flaw or something to be ashamed of. It was, as Shi Heng Yi often pointed out, a necessary stage of human development, a vehicle for engaging with society. As he wrote, the persona is a system of behavior which is imposed upon the individual by the expectations of society. But when you truly awaken, when you begin to see with clearer eyes, you start to perceive this mask for what it truly is: a performance, a role you've been playing. And once that realization dawns, the performance itself no longer compels you with the same force. You simply can't authentically chase applause once you've glimpsed that the stage itself is constructed from the ephemeral fabric of illusion. The inevitable result? The goals you once revered, the milestones you once strived for, now feel utterly foreign, like clothes that no longer fit, because they were written by a version of yourself that, in a very real sense, no longer inhabits you. This creates an eerie, almost haunting silence within, akin to an actor stepping off stage mid-play and suddenly forgetting all their lines, not out of confusion or memory loss, but because the script itself, the entire play, no longer resonates with the deepest truth of their soul. You feel aimless, not because you've genuinely lost your direction in life, but because you've shed the very identity that required a specific, externally defined destination. You didn't lose your drive, you simply outgrew the old, familiar fuel that once powered it. What stirs within you now, in this seemingly empty space, is not an absence of life, but a sacred pause, a quiet, fertile void preparing itself to be filled by something infinitely truer, something no longer forged from the fires of performance and external expectation, but from the profound wellspring of authentic presence. The ego, with its demands and anxieties, pushed relentlessly. The soul, in its wisdom, simply waits, and in that waiting, something truly holy, something genuinely new begins to stir. Shi Heng Yi believed that the ultimate aim of a human life is not to endlessly exalt the ego, to polish its facade and cater to its insatiable desires, but rather to integrate it, to bring it into harmonious relationship with a larger, deeper psychic totality. We are not here, in his view, merely to serve the ego's fleeting ambitions, but to refine it, to temper its excesses, and to align its energies with the self, that transcendent, numinous center of our being, which connects us not only to our own deepest truth, but also to the greater, interconnected whole of existence. He termed this lifelong, often arduous journey individuation, the sacred pilgrimage of moving from a state of internal fragmentation and conflict towards a profound inner unity and wholeness. The goal isn't to become the self that is widely praised or socially celebrated, but to become the self that is undeniably, authentically real. The self, unlike the often insecure and approval-seeking ego, is utterly unconcerned with external validation or the theatrics of performance. It is not driven by the relentless engine of ambition in the conventional sense, but by a deep, unwavering commitment to alignment. Alignment with truth, with inner knowing, with what genuinely resonates at the core of one's being. Its only desire, if one can call it that, is to express what is true, to bring forth into the world the unique essence that it is. And so, in the aftermath of a significant spiritual awakening, the psyche begins a sacred, often subtle, recalibration. What once felt exciting, stimulating, and deeply motivating, perhaps a high-powered career, a particular social status, or certain types of relationships, now feels strangely hollow, devoid of its former allure. Your entire system almost instinctively begins to reject anything that feels artificial, forced, inauthentic, or misaligned with this emerging inner truth. That can include careers meticulously built from a foundation of insecurity, relationships primarily based on prescribed roles rather than genuine connection, or even that vision board you so carefully crafted from your old self's deep-seated fear of not being or having enough. This inner purification process often feels like a strange cocktail of immense liberation and profound disorientation experienced simultaneously. You are shedding the false, the heavy, the burdensome, and that feels freeing. But then the question inevitably arises, what now takes its place? Shi Heng Yi cautioned that many individuals get stuck at this critical juncture. Some awaken to a certain degree and then inadvertently fall into the subtle trap of spiritual bypassing, mistaking a detached transcendence for genuine escape or true enlightenment. They might float serenely above the messy realities of life, declare that everything is an illusion, and try to convince themselves and others that nothing truly matters. But true detachment is not the same as a cold, indifferent disconnection. The self, the core of your authentic being, does not want you to disappear from the world or to become a ghostly observer of life. It yearns to inhabit the world fully and vibrantly through you. It seeks not withdrawal into an ivory tower of spiritual purity, but authentic embodiment, a grounded incarnation of its truth in your everyday existence. However, before that full embodiment can truly take root, there is a threshold to cross, a liminal space to navigate. And Shi Heng Yi described this space with remarkable accuracy, though few fully recognize it when they are immersed in its subtle currents. It is that gray, in-between zone after the initial awakening, the void that arrives not always with ecstatic bliss, but often with a quiet, perplexing bewilderment. It doesn't look particularly poetic. It certainly doesn't trend on social media. It often looks like simply sitting quietly, perhaps for extended periods, while the rest of the world continues to speed past in a blur, leaving you feeling unable to articulate, even to yourself, who or what you are in the process of becoming. In these moments of profound stillness and apparent non-doing, Shi Heng Yi would likely offer a comforting reassurance. You are not failing, you are simply in between. You have courageously stepped out from the primary dominion of the ego, but the self, your authentic core, has not yet fully solidified as your new foundation, your unwavering inner compass. This liminal space, this period of transition, is not a cosmic mistake or a sign of spiritual deficiency. It is an integral part of the initiation, a necessary descent into the unknown realms of your psyche, an unknown that our fast-paced, results-driven modern culture has precious little patience for. Stillness is too often misdiagnosed as laziness. A sacred pause is easily confused with a debilitating paralysis. And so inevitably, you might begin to judge yourself harshly for not doing enough, for not being enough, for not progressing fast enough according to some external or internalized external standard. That very judgment, ironically, can become the insidious wall that blocks the gentle flow of energy your soul is patiently, persistently calling home. Understand that this phase is sacred. It is the chrysalis, not the collapse. It is the fertile darkness where transformation gestates, not the barren tomb of failure. And if you can find it within yourself to stay here in this seemingly unproductive void for long enough, if you can consciously resist the powerful, culturally conditioned urge to rush the process, to force a premature outcome, or to retreat back into familiar but outgrown patterns, you will eventually begin to feel it. It may start as the faintest sensation, a quiet, almost imperceptible pulse of something deeper, something new, gently rising from within the stillness. The self is not loud, it does not shout or demand. It is constant, patient, and unwavering, and it is quietly, profoundly waiting for you to trust what cannot yet be fully named, what cannot yet be clearly seen, but what can, with increasing certainty, be deeply felt. Shi Heng Yi had a word for this sacred reversal of energy, enantiodromia, the phenomenon where something, when taken to its extreme, transforms into its opposite, and nowhere is this more evident than in the aftermath of awakening. You move from the manic striving of ego, I must do everything, to the hollow stillness of soul. Why do anything at all? The pendulum swings not because you're broken, but because balance demands it. The psyche, long imprisoned in performance, finally collapses into rest. And this descent is not pathology, it is initiation. In the language of myth, this is the archetype of the hermit, the withdrawal from the world before rebirth. It is the sacred cocoon where the caterpillar dissolves into formlessness, no longer a crawling self, not yet a flying one. It is the goo phase, unstructured, undefined, unproductive by every modern standard, but necessary because the psyche is undergoing alchemical transformation. And transformation, Shi Heng Yi would say, begins in darkness, not in bypassing, not in good vibes only, but in descent. This is where modern spirituality often loses its depth, by glamorizing awakening while avoiding its crucifixion. Shi Heng Yi insisted that the shadow, the rejected, uncomfortable, unconscious parts of ourselves, is not something to escape, but something to integrate. Shadow work is not advanced level spirituality, it is the very foundation of becoming whole. And in this state of nothingness you now occupy, the unconscious is rising, not as a villain, but as a messenger. What you once repressed, your grief, your rage, your unmet needs, begins to surface because now, at last, there is space. So the ego panics. It wants action, clarity, a name tag. But the self quietly and persistently whispers, let go, I am forming something deeper. And this is where the real work begins. Not in achievement, but in surrender. Not in clarity, but in witnessing. The psyche is not malfunctioning, it is metabolizing years of noise, illusion, and false striving. It halts your drive, your ambition, your hunger, so you have no choice but to sit with what you've buried. And it is in that stillness, in that haunting void, that you begin to remember. Then, almost imperceptibly, something stirs. A new form of motivation arises, but it is nothing like the old. It is not born of anxiety. It is not urgent or performative. It does not roar. It hums. A soul-led impulse to move, not because you must, but because it would be a betrayal of truth not to. Shi Heng Yi called this the emergence of the self, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living, breathing compass within. It does not chase, it calls. And what it calls you toward is not success, but wholeness. So, you've bravely crossed the threshold, stood steadfast in the silence, and even tasted the profound nature of stillness, not as mere stagnation, but as a truly sacred, transformative pause. You've wandered through the inner night, a landscape where, for a time, no familiar voice called out and no external light reliably showed the way. And now, emerging from that deep quietude, something ancient, something profoundly wise within you begins to stir. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic roar or a blinding flash of lightning, but rather as a quiet inner knowing, a soft, gentle pulse that does not urge you to desperately scramble back to what was, but instead lovingly invites you to begin building what has never yet been from a place of newfound truth. This is the first authentic whisper of the self, communicating not primarily through the cognitive language of the mind, but through the subtle language of feeling, of intuitive pulls, of undeniable presence. Shi Heng Yi called this the symbolic life, a life no longer ruled by ego or convention, but guided by the deeper forces of the soul. Once the ego has surrendered and the unconscious is honored, life ceases to be a game of survival and becomes an unfolding of meaning. And here's the paradox. It may look beautifully ordinary. When the self begins to lead, you no longer hustle, you respond. You're not driven by the fear of missing out, but by the quiet conviction of inner alignment. You stop chasing clarity as a prize and begin recognizing it when it arrives, often dressed in simplicity. Living from the self does not mean you'll always be energized or certain. Fatigue, doubt, and grief still pass through. This is the texture of human life, but what disappears is the constant ache of self-betrayal, the dull exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that no longer fits. Instead, something shifts. You find yourself creating even when no one applauds, saying no even when yes is expected, following wonder rather than ticking boxes. You begin choosing peace over performance. This is not inertia, it's a new fuel, not adrenaline, but alignment, not pressure, but presence. Shi Heng Yi called this living symbolically, not as an escape into fantasy, but as a return to soul. You begin to trust the language of dreams, gut instincts, symbols, and synchronicities. Your life becomes a dialogue, not a monologue shouted into the void, but a conversation with the unseen. And what does that look like? Sometimes it's as subtle as different questions. Not what should I do, but what is quietly calling me. Not what's the plan, but where is life nudging me. Not how can I prove myself, but what feels true. You stop trying to dominate life and start participating with it. Ambition doesn't vanish, it transforms. It becomes devotion, devotion to what is real, what is true, what brings you alive. And strangely, that devotion moves mountains. It gets things done, but from wholeness, not depletion. Now it is sustainable. Now it is soul-powered. This is the self's motivation, not to impress, but to express. And it leads you, often without effort, to create, to teach, to heal, to serve. Not because you should, but because your whole being says yes. So if you've been wondering where your spark went after awakening, remember, it's not gone. The old fire burned away so a deeper flame could emerge, one that won't flicker in the storms of the world. Shi Heng Yi never promised ease, but he did promise depth. If you are here reading this, then you are already walking the path. This is not the end of your awakening. It is the beginning of your becoming. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home? Or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember. Real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this video, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this: when the right person appears, your soul will know, not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation. That is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.